oral questions. Question orale, the Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Invoked the Emergencies Act. 24 hours in, and there are more questions than answers. Questions about whether this is justified, questions around if the criteria is met, questions around what this means to Canadians' rights and freedoms. Parliamentary approval is required in order for the Prime Minister to use this unprecedented sledgehammer. So, can the Prime Minister tell us, when will Parliament be debating this? Will it be coming to us on Friday? And does he expect that we will look at it Friday, but then rise, take a week off, and not actually deal with this until March?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, after discussions with Cabinet and caucus, after consultations with the premiers of all provinces and territories, after conversation with opposition leaders, we decided to invoke the Emergencies Act to supplement provincial and territorial capacity to address the blockades and occupations. I want to be very clear, Mr. Speaker. The scope of these measures are time-limited and geographically targeted. They are reasonable and proportionate to the threats they are meant to address, and they are fully to be compliant with the Charter of Rights and Freedoms to reassure all Canadians that this is the right thing to move forward.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
I had a very simple question to the Prime Minister he was not able to answer. It would appear this could be more political drama for the Prime Minister. He name-calls people that he disagrees with. He wedges, he divides, he stigmatizes. Yet in spite of all of his failure, Coote's border has cleared. Windsor has opened up. Provinces and police are doing their jobs, and blockades are starting to come down. But the Prime Minister thinks that now is the time to use this extreme measure and invoke the Emergencies Act. Isn't it true that the Prime Minister's actions could serve to actually make things worse and not make things better?
Exactly. The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, this is about keeping Canadians safe, protecting their communities and neighbourhoods, and ensuring the jobs and our economy.
I'm afraid I'm going to have to interrupt the Right Honourable Prime Minister. I'm trying to hear the answer, and I'm having a very difficult time. There's some shouting going on. I'm going to have to ask the honourable members, maybe just keep it down. And if you've got something that you're not agreeing with, talk amongst yourself with someone next to you. You don't have to shout it out to the person across the floor. The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, you are absolutely right. This is a time for responsible leadership, not crass partisanship. The situation requires additional tools not held by other federal, provincial, or territorial law. It's what responsible leadership requires. These measures must be and will be compliant with the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. We will always defend the rights of Canadians to peaceful assembly and to freedom of expression, but these blockades need to end, and unfortunately, Conservative politicians continue to encourage the leaders of these blockades.
Well, Leader of the Opposition.
Well, let's get down to the basics of what this is really about. This is about the Prime Minister's ideological attachment to keeping COVID restrictions and mandates. 63% of Canadians want the restrictions and mandates to end. Conservatives presented a motion yesterday asking simply for a plan, but the Prime Minister is in denial and is ignoring the science. He might as well be back at the cottage because he's doing nothing productive or constructive to help this situation. Can the Prime Minister tell Canadians when he will end the divisive, outdated, and unscientific mandate and restrictions?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, like I said, this is a time for responsible leadership to end these blockades. Unfortunately, the Conservatives continue to play partisan games. The Conservative member of Provincial just yesterday...
I'm sorry, I'm going to have to cut off the Prime Minister just for a second. And just... I mean, heckling is usually throwing one comment out. Clever, hopefully, although not always necessary. But what I'm hearing is someone bullying and trying to drown someone out. That's not heckling. I just want everyone to take a deep breath, and I'll let the Prime Minister start from the top, please.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Unfortunately, we see that even in a moment of extremely challenging times, when people are moving forward with responsible leadership and responsible tools, the Conservatives can't help themselves but play crass political games and divide. The Conservative member for Provincial just yesterday embraced the leaders of this blockade and amplified their cause. The Conservative member for Yorkton Melville said this weekend that blockaders who ripped down fencing around our national war memorial are patriots. The Conservative leadership contender from Carleton continues to say he's...
Mr. Speaker, the invocation of the Emergencies Act for the first time in Canadian history is a damning indictment on the failure of this Prime Minister to address the situation. The Prime Minister once said, I quote, "When a government asks its citizens to give up even a small portion of their liberty, it is not simply enough to say, trust us. That trust must be earned, it must be checked, and it must be renewed." These are his words. Canadians do not trust this Prime Minister. When will he stop undermining Canadians' rights and start renewing Canadians' trust?
The Honourable Minister for Public Safety.
Mr. Speaker, Canadians can trust that this government will always follow the science and the best evidence to get us out of this pandemic, and that includes getting vaccinated, Mr. Speaker. And contrary to what my colleague says, this is an illegal blockade. This illegal blockade is not about the vaccines or the mandates. It's about a very small, organized group who are trying to upend our way of life, Mr. Speaker. Now, we've made progress. We've seen the Ambassador Bridge reopened. We've seen Coots reopened. We've seen Surrey reopened. And, Mr. Speaker, yesterday, yes, we invoked the Emergencies Act so that we can secure that progress and give law enforcement all of the tools they need. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Sturgeon River Parkland.
Well, we'll see if the Prime Minister answers this one. Every opportunity he has had to de-escalate this situation in Ottawa and around Canada, he has chosen to hide, to confront, and to escalate. His divisive conduct has been a lesson in abject failure. Blockades should come down. They are already coming down across this country. But now the Prime Minister has invoked the Emergencies Act to punish Canadians who, in his words, hold unacceptable views. Why is the Prime Minister punishing Canadians for their political views?
The Honourable Government House Leader.
That the former Conservative leader, now the member for Regina Capel with the Conservative Party, said the following: "These protesters, these activists, may have the luxury of spending days at a time at a blockade, but they need to check their privilege. They need to check their privilege and let the people whose jobs depend on the railway system and small business and farmers do their jobs." And what have they said now in this context from the beginning? As swastikas flew, as Confederate flags flew, they went out and they gave coffee. They took pictures. They have absolutely the opposite of responsible leadership. Instead of de-escalating, they escalated at every turn.
The Honourable Member for Calgary Midnapore.
Are you done now? For 2 years, the Prime Minister has insisted he is making decisions based...
I just want to remind the Honourable Members to place their questions through the Speaker. I'll let her restart her question.
Sorry, Mr. Speaker.
From the top.
Again, my apologies. For 2 years, the Prime Minister has insisted he is making decisions based on science. Canadians sacrificed, they isolated, closed businesses, got vaccinated because experts advised it was the safest way forward. Now, those same experts say it is time to ease restrictions. Premiers are listening, but this Prime Minister believes he knows better and has invoked the Emergency Measures Act. Does the Prime Minister intend to force provinces to implement measures they and science disagree with?
The Honourable Government House Leader.
I'll tell you what I'm done with. I'm done with seeing as this protest continues, as illegal actions continue that cost billions of dollars to businesses, that terrorize downtown residents. I am tired of seeing Conservative tweets, such as the member from Bergen who's saying that he supports it, the member for Yorkton Melville saying that that ripping down barricades in front of a war memorial is a patriotic act, watching somebody who aspires to be leader of Conservative Party saying that what's happening outside is something he stands by. That is enough. Please, it's time to end this. Stop supporting what's going on outside.
The Honourable Member for Calgary Midnapore.
Mr. Speaker, the rest of the world is opening up, and returning to normal, where the science supports it, provinces are providing Canadians with hope for the first time in 2 years, contrary to this Prime Minister, whose lack of leadership has brought him to invoke the Emergency Measures Act, traumatizing Canadians. He is well aware that many provinces are opposed to these measures. He is also well aware that the science says that they are not needed. Will this Prime Minister force provinces to implement measures that they had independently decided to remove?
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, Canada has one of the lowest death rates in the world, one of the highest vaccination rates in the world. It has met the challenge of this pandemic. But what has not been met in this hour of history is that as the chaos descended outside, as protesters began to shut down critical infrastructure, we had lawmakers, people of this House, going out and encouraging their activity. And I have to ask, Mr. Speaker, if they didn't have lawmakers who were elected by constituents encouraging their illegal actions, when would this have been over? I think it would have been over a lot sooner.
The Honourable Member for Peterborough-Kawartha.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday during a press conference, the Prime Minister said, and I quote, "Some people will say we moved too quickly. Other people will say, no, we should have acted weeks ago. The reality is this: the Emergencies Act is not something to take lightly. It is not the first thing you turn to, nor the second, nor the third." So my question is, Mr. Speaker, can the Prime Minister please tell Canadians what first, second, and third actions he took before invoking the emergency?
The Honourable Minister for Emergency Preparedness.
You know, right from the outset of the blockades and the disruptions that were taking place in Ottawa, and then the blockades at our critical infrastructure at our ports of entry, our government has worked with municipal and provincial partners right across the country in order to ensure that they had the resources and the support they needed to keep Canadians safe.
I'm sorry, I'm going to have to ask the Minister to repeat. I'm right next to you, or to the Honourable Member, and I can't hear it because of the shouting. If I can ask the Honourable Minister to start from the top so that at least I can hear it, and hopefully the Honourable Member for Peterborough-Kawartha can hear the answer.
First, Mr. Speaker, I'm actually very glad to see that the Conservatives have once again changed their position on something important. Whereas first they supported these blockades, and now that they recognize that this is a largely foreign-funded, targeted, and coordinating attack on Canadian critical infrastructure, they flip-flop. Good for them. We're all getting used to it.
The member for Peterborough-Kawartha.
Mr. Speaker, I think the person or the party that has flip-flopped is the Liberals. Last week, you said you had all the tools they needed to do this. And now we have an Emergency Measures Act.
Yeah.
We were told we would never need federal vaccine mandates. That changed. Now you're saying it's just jurisdiction. How can we trust this government? How much authority does the Prime Minister need to set an unprecedented Emergency Measures Act? How much authority does he need?
The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the evidence is clear. A largely foreign-funded, targeted, and coordinating attack on critical Canadian infrastructure at our borders is hurting Canada and harming Canadians. And, Mr. Speaker, it was equally clear that we needed to do more, and we would have to do what was required. Mr. Speaker, we've introduced measures that will create greater financial scrutiny and financial consequences for the people who are engaged in this criminal behavior. The evidence of firearms at Coots elevates the risk to Canadian security and safety, and we will do what is required to keep Canadians safe.
The Honourable Member for Saskatoon West.
Mr. Speaker, last Friday, the Prime Minister said that the Ottawa Police had enough resources to deal with the protesters. That's right. And on Monday, he calls for emergency measures. Boy, that escalated quickly. He had 17 days to act, and after hiding at his cottage on his MacBook for the first week, he did nothing but divide and stigmatize. Mr. Speaker, the constituents in Saskatoon West want to know what changed in the Prime Minister's mind over the weekend to justify such drastic measures.
The Honourable Minister for Public Safety.
Mr.
Speaker, I want to assure my colleague that the RCMP has been supporting and aiding the Ottawa Police Service to enforce public safety, not only here in Ottawa, but in Windsor, where we've reopened the Ambassador Bridge, in Coots, where the border's reopened, in Surrey, where the border's reopened, and that's good. It's good for the economy. It's good for Canadians who can get back to work, Mr. Speaker. And yesterday's invocation of the Emergencies Act is meant to secure those gains so that we give the police all of the tools that they need, whether it's declaring certain zones which are adjacent to our borders, to our national symbols, Mr. Speaker. It's important for the Conservatives to ask those participating in the illegal blockades to now go home.
The honourable member for Niagara Falls.
Mr. Speaker, for too long, Conservatives have been calling on this government to remove the mandatory PCR test requirements for those entering Canada. In my riding of Niagara Falls, this policy has had a devastating impact on our economy. Visits from the U.S. are nowhere near the record levels reached in 2019, and these expensive costs put on our visitors and Canadians traveling prevent them from visiting their families and loved ones. My residents want to know this: when will all federal travel mandates be ended?
The Honourable Minister of Transport.
Speaker, I want to thank my honourable colleague for giving me the opportunity to share with him and all members of this House and all Canadians the great announcement that myself and our colleagues made today. Today, based on the science and the public health advice we received, we eased our travel measure, including, Mr. Speaker, allowing incoming travelers to use an antigen test instead of the PCR test, pre-departure test. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Member for Abbotsford.
Well, Canadians are stressed. Paychecks don't buy what they used to. In fact, the cost of everything, gasoline, groceries, housing, is at all-time highs. Families are getting left behind. So last April, I wrote to the minister to warn her of exactly that. I highlighted the dangers of uncontrolled borrowing and how excessive stimulus spending would stoke inflationary pressures. She either doesn't care or didn't read my letter. So to the minister, what specifically is she doing to get inflation under control?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the Conservatives continue, actually in all aspects of Canadian life, to put forward a false narrative. And the latest false narrative we've just been hearing today is about the economy. The reality is that the Canadian economy is recovering strongly from the COVID recession. In the third quarter, our GDP grew by 5.4%. That is higher than the US, Japan, the UK, and Australia. And you know what, Mr. Speaker? When it comes to our debt to GDP ratio, our AAA credit rating was reaffirmed in the fall by S&P and Moody's.
The Honourable Member for Abbotsford.
Well, we will never get inflation under control as long as that minister keeps borrowing and spending like there's no tomorrow. Not only did the minister ignore our concerns, she also ignored the warnings of the parliamentary budget officer, who questioned the wisdom of her stimulus spending, pumping more money into the economy when the cost of living is skyrocketing. This minister is making this crisis worse. This problem is not transitory. Month by month, the inflation numbers are going up. When will the minister finally do something to protect Canadians against the skyrocketing cost of living?
Right to the Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
You know, Mr. Speaker, the real question is, when will the Conservatives stick with a policy or stick with a leader? Because I was on the campaign trail in the summer, and so were the members opposite, and they actually campaigned on proposed government spending higher than our own proposal. We proposed a deficit for 21-22 of $156.9 billion. They campaigned on a proposed deficit of $168 billion. So I wonder if the party of flip-flops can tell Canadians where they stand today.
The Honourable Member for Bay of Quinte.
Mr. Speaker, for weeks, Canadians looking for hope have been looking for a Prime Minister to listen to their concerns and listen to their needs as the rest of the world opened up. Instead, they heard from a Prime Minister with an escalating tone that left them feeling traumatized, stigmatized, and divided. Even today, he's calling out and blaming other parties who have been listening instead of pitting Canadian versus Canadian and showing real leadership. Yep. Why do Canadians have to pay with their freedoms to cover up for this government's failed leadership?
The Honourable Government House House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, I think we have different definitions of division. To me, when critical infrastructure is being blocked, when illegal protesters are outside, when we see swastikas and Confederate flags going out and taking photographs and giving coffee, I don't think that's healthy for the country, Mr. Speaker. Instead, what I think would be healthy is to say to those that would seek to divide us, those that would seek to exploit our differences, to say those kinds of radical views do not have a place in this country. It's time to go home. It's time to end this illegal activity, and it's time to come together as a country.
Honourable member for Chatham-Kent-Leamington.
Mr. Speaker, on Friday I asked this government if it was their intent to place public health policy in direct conflict with immigration legislation. Once their working permits expire after February 28th, some guest workers are trapped in Canada without status, separated from their family, separated from work. The Minister of Immigration's response made it clear that this government had no apparent idea of this policy conflict. When will this Liberal government treat innocent people fairly, humanely, and respect them and fix this Liberal fiasco?
That's right.